Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Rose. I'm the Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thanks so much for joining us today for Cold War Spaces. Today's guest is Arch Getty on the topic of ballot space, Soviet elections in perspective. Arch Getty is Distinguished Research Professor of History at the University of California, Los Angeles. He's a historian specializing in the Stalin period and the history of Soviet Communist Party. He's written 7 books, including Practicing Stalinism, Bolsheviks, Boyars, and the Persistence of Tradition. We're very glad to welcome him today to share his expertise about general elections in the Soviet Union and in modern-day Russia, as well as discuss our upcoming election. I'd also like to mention that he'll be joining us in November for a lecture presented by the Wende and the UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies. It'll be called Soviet Anti-Semitisms and will be at noon on Friday, November 20th. Today's program will be about a 30-minute conversation between Arch and Joes Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. After that, there'll be about 15 minutes for Q&A, so please get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time. We ask that you please keep them short, no longer than a sentence or 2. And we do have the chat open, so it's always nice to see where people are tuning in from. If you want to say what city you're tuning in from, you can put that in the chat. And please remember there's a blue button there. It defaults to just panelists, so please switch it to panelists and attendees so everyone else can see your messages. We'll be posting the recording of today's program on our Vimeo page, where you can find the recordings of all of our past virtual programming. And lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And I'll hand it off to you to get started.
Thank you very much, Anna Rose. Il faut être de son temps, which freely translates as you have to move with your time, is a famous quote from the French 19th century artist Honoré Daumier. We are taking his suggestion quite literally by focusing this week's and next week's Cold War Spaces program on elections. Today, we are looking into the history of the ballot in the Soviet Union, from Stalin to Gorbachev, and we will also address more recent Russian elections under Vladimir Putin and ask the unavoidable question about the differences and similarities with the upcoming November elections in the United States. I'm thrilled to discuss these topics with one of the leading historians of Soviet history, Arch Getty. Arch, welcome to Cold War Spaces.
Thank you, Joes. It's delightful to be here.
Great. And let me start with a more personal question. So early in your career, you have been criticized for arguing that structural factors are at least as important in understanding Soviet history as, for instance, Stalin's personality traits. And nowadays that seems like common sense among historians, but I'm curious to hear why it was deemed so outrageous and even dangerous earlier in your career.
Well, the original sort of baseline study of the Soviet Union was done during the Cold War. And during the Cold War, there was a kind of know your enemy feeling. We had just come out of World War II. It was a kind of a natural equation that Stalin must be like Hitler, the total and absolute omniscient, omnipotent dictator. And then when a new generation came along and began to find questions and anomalies about this, wondered about structures, wondered about social history, some of us thought that if you look down the power ladder a little bit and not focus so much on the Politburo, you saw a very different picture. A picture that had to do with disobedience, it had to do with power plays, unintended consequences. And you know, that was received badly by the previous generation. When we suggested that there was more to Soviet history broadly defined, than Stalin's biography, it didn't go over so well.
Do you think that was a matter of professional controversy or power play from your older colleagues?
I think it was both. It's hard to separate professional disputes because so many people are personally invested in their interpretations. Right. And you know, if you have made a reputation pushing one particular line and somebody else pushes another line, it's personal.
Yeah, well, I'm very happy that you helped construct a much broader view on, in this case, Soviet history. So we are going to speak about elections, and actually something like Soviet democracy might sound to many as a contradiction in terms. Could you briefly explain to us what Soviet democracy is about and how it was structured?
Well, democracy in the Soviet Union and in other communist systems has a different meaning than it does here. When we think about democracy, we think about choosing candidates. We think about the voice of the people, determining who's going to be the leader, what the policies are going to be. Communist systems had a very different idea about democracy. This is why you find, in the oddest places, the People's Democratic Republic of this and that, which at first glance seems totally bizarre. But democracy, democratic, means in the communist context for the people, not necessarily of the people. In other words, the idea was that if the government is doing everything in a kind of egalitarian way, with the interests of poor people at heart, with the interests of the common person at heart, then by definition, they are, quote, democratic, unquote. So in part, it's a matter of definition, I think.
Right, but the original concept of Soviets seems to be something that is very grassroots in its essence and bottom up, whereas the Soviet political structure was very much top down.
Yeah, it was, especially when you talk about elections. Almost always there's one candidate for each slot. And I think that's because elections there in the Soviet Union had a different function than they do here. Again, it wasn't so much about choosing candidates because, after all, the party knows who is the best. The party will offer you their idea of the best slate. It's not about choice. And going to vote in the Soviet Union was a different kind of thing. You didn't go to choose candidates. It was more of a ceremonial patriotic display. You went and voted for the party slate as a kind of performance. I mean, it was like going to a 4th of July parade here. It was a sign of your patriotism. It was a sign of your participation. And therefore, that means that the political system, in a sense, the democratic part, was structured entirely differently.
Right. Well, you mentioned the elections as a kind of ritual, and actually there were always only just one candidate for each election from the Communist Party, evidently. And it was even sufficient to hand in a blank ballot paper to vote for the candidates. On the other hand, if you wanted to sound dissident or another voice, you had to go into the ballot booth to make your vote against or cross out the candidate. So it was, I assume, immediately clear when someone intended to be naughty, so to speak. Can you tell us how many people actually voted against candidates, and were there personal repercussions if they did so?
You're right. If you went into the booth to mark the ballot in any way, it was a dead giveaway that you were going to vote against. And so much for the secret ballot idea, which was guaranteed in the Constitution, but in practice didn't really exist. We don't have any good statistics about how many people went in there. That was not a statistic that the Soviet regime liked to publish. The impression we have, though, is that very few people actually did that. It was a black mark against you. There was a social stigma attached to it. You weren't on the team, you weren't part of the program. It could lead to repercussions at your job, about promotions. There are all kinds of kind of negative effects here. But some people did do it. Primarily, people did it literally to attract attention. Dissidents did it in a very showy kind of way. People who were making a protest and willing to suffer the consequences, they would likely go in there and mark the ballot. Most people didn't, obviously, for a lot of reasons. Some of those reasons just had to do with patriotism. Like I say, it was like marching in the 4th of July parade. I mean, it was something you did, heartfelt. On the other hand, at lower levels, at neighborhood levels, let's say, there was a lot more crossing out, we think. And that's because for most people in the Soviet Union, maybe most people everywhere, as Tip O'Neill used to say, politics is local. In other words, for a lot of people, their contact with the regime, whatever that regime may be, has to do with fixing the potholes, a roof on the school, making the buses run on time, local day-to-day living type issues.
Mhm.
And it was local candidates, local Soviet members who took care of those things. So if the potholes weren't being fixed and the school wasn't functioning the way it was, you'd cross out the guy and somebody else would come along.
Yeah,
So
so
there was crossing out, but it was almost entirely local, I would say.
right, and it was effective on a local level, right?
Yeah, it worked. It
Yeah.
worked because, you get enough crossouts, that means the party has to come up with somebody else.
Right. Interesting, yeah. So you mentioned the Constitution of 1936, and remarkably, the Constitution guaranteed civil rights, personal freedoms, and also democratic election process. But evidently there was a huge gap between theory and practice.
Mhm.
Why bother with a constitution at all if it didn't mean anything?
Well, a couple of reasons, I think. There's a lot of truth to the standard explanation that it was for show. It was a public relations event, not only internally, but externally. I mean, remember that this is the time of the rising threat of Hitler. It was a time of appeasement. What are the Western democracies going to do about Hitler? Stalin wants to figure out some kind of coalition to stop Hitler. His collective security was the name of his attempted policy. And therefore, the Constitution was a kind of a signal to public opinion in Britain and France. It's okay to ally with the Soviet Union. See, we're democratic, just like you. So there's that aspect to the new Constitution. But there was also a kind of a real effect to it. Yes, freedom of speech was a dead letter from the very beginning, freedom of association, all of these things that we associate with a constitution. On the other hand, it was important to several classes of people in the Soviet Union. Since 1917, since the revolution and the Russian Civil War, there were whole segments of the population that had been excluded from citizenship. People who had served under the Tsar, policemen who had served under the Tsar, people who had fought against the Bolsheviks at some point, peasants who had resisted the regime at some point. These excluded people, they were called in Russian former people, the Constitution restored their civil rights. And the civil rights that were important there was the right to work, the right to a pension, the right to education. So for certain groups of people in the Soviet population, the Constitution was real and it was important.
Right. Nevertheless, 1 year after the Constitution was accepted, it was the year of the Great Purge. So
yeah, so much for free speech.
Exactly.
If the police are going to come. On the other hand, there's an interesting nuance here about the Great Purge and the Constitution. The Constitution guaranteed multiple candidates for each slot, a secret ballot, all of these things. And there was a moment in 1937 during the Great Purge where Stalin actually proposed multiple candidates, secret ballot. I mean, a real election right in the middle of the terror. He does this for a variety of reasons, partly because he's at war with his own bureaucracy. That bureaucracy they become victims of the terror. And he wants to use the election as a kind of a way to, as he put it, a stick to beat the bureaucracy. He was encouraging people to vote against the bureaucracy. Now, the problem was, and this falls under one of my favorite categories of unintended consequences. The problem was, all of a sudden, these formerly hostile people, policemen, priests, peasants, all of a sudden they start running for office under the new Constitution. And the party was horrified, and Stalin was horrified. So the experiment was canceled a few months later. But the interplay between the Constitution and the Great Purges is really an interesting one.
Right, right.
You know, lots of scholars in Russia, Zhukov, Sam Lom, lots of people have investigated this, and it turns out to be more complicated than we thought.
Right. So moving forward to 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev introduced an element of democratization in the electoral process, not by allowing people who were not members of the Communist Party, but at least to allowing alternative candidates. And can you tell us how did that work out? What was the consequence of that step?
Well, the 1987 experiment didn't work out at all. As you pointed out, only party candidates could run in this early attempt. And that meant that the party hardliners, you know, were able to maintain control of the system. And they were against Gorbachev and he against them. It returned to kind of a standard Soviet, Supreme Soviet, rather than a democratic assembly as Gorbachev had wanted. It becomes important, though, because its very failure leads Gorbachev to propose new and different measures 2 years later in 1989.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and speaking about 1989, that's the March and April elections when voters actually for the first time dealt a heavy blow, I would say, to the party establishment, since even party members who ran without any opposition, such as the Communist Party leader of Leningrad, were defeated because enough voters crossed out his name on the ballot to deny him the required majority. So what can you tell us about the impact of the 1989 elections?
This one was for real. This one really had an impact. As you said, the head of the Leningrad Party organization, a Politburo member, in fact, was not elected. 20 or 30 members of the party central committee were not elected. This was unprecedented that these guys could be voted down. On the other hand, a third of the membership of the body, the new Democratic Assembly, a third was still reserved for party members. And enough of them managed to get themselves elected or re-elected so that hardliners were still able to block things as a result of this 1989 election. But as with the 1987 election, it becomes a stimulus for further reform. Its very failure in Gorbachev's eyes and in the eyes of the liberals, its very failure stimulates even bigger changes. For example, Boris Yeltsin was elected in 1989. Right. And we know that that plants the seed of a mega event. It convinces Gorbachev, the 1989 election, that he has to strike even harder at the Communist Party. The party was just not going to support him. That was a tough pill to swallow for Gorbachev because he was a party man. Right. The fact that the party has really kind of taken a stand here that they're going to resist his perestroika plans leads him to the idea of changing the Soviet Constitution, abolishing the so-called Article 6 of the Constitution. Article 6 had guaranteed the Communist Party a monopoly, the only legitimate political party. When Article 6 is struck down, all of a sudden there are new political parties. Right. And in the longer run, the failure of the 1989 failure as a true democratic step forward is eventually going to lead Yeltsin to disband the party altogether later.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. So speaking about later, according to an article in the Washington Post from July 2020, Stalin said at a party meeting in 1923 that voting is completely unimportant. What is important is who will count the votes and how they are counted. And according to the same article, this is also true for Russian elections under Vladimir Putin. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, you know, there's a whole growth industry in Russia and in the West of things that Stalin is supposed to have said. There's just a vast number of apocryphal quotes attributed to him that he never really said. As far as we know, he never really said this particular thing about counting votes. We do know that other politicians have said this. We know that Napoleon said it. We know that Boss Tweed in the New York political machine of the 19th century, we know that he said it.
Right.
But we don't have any source, any evidence at all that Stalin actually said it. It would have been, by the way, a dumb thing for him to say,
Absolutely, yeah.
while he himself is struggling for power.
We know that politicians sometimes have dumb things to say, so in that sense.
But it doesn't mean it's not true, by the way.
Right,
In
right.
Soviet context, it is important who counts the votes.
Absolutely, but irrespective of the source of the quote, would you say this is a good way to describe the situation of the elections under Vladimir Putin?
I would say so.
Why?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have nobody in the Putin party has been caught red-handed on the national level.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, there are pretty believable cases of regional fake counts, especially in Siberia, which, the perception that the elections in Siberia have been faked is one of the things that led to the sort of explosive popularity of Navalny, the protester.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the things, by the way, that led him to go to Siberia, Navalny, and launch a major democratic campaign to get new candidates in. And surprise of surprises, he was poisoned there and then.
Right, right. And then we had the referendum from June 25th to July 1st this year, which was about amendments in the political structure, but also included the idea that Vladimir Putin could remain president until 2036. And officially, there was a huge majority in favor of these changes, but they are highly contested. Again, my question, what do you think about that?
Oh, I think, yes, they are contested, but I mean, my guess would be that it was probably a genuinely popular idea. If you think about it for a minute, Russia since the 15th century has never been ruled in any other way than one guy rules for life, unless he's violently overthrown. Therefore, Putin as president for life is not that different from the trend of Russian history. The second thing is a lot of Russians know that Putin is a dictator, or at least a dictator wannabe. They know that he's corrupt and that the people around him are corrupt. But it's one of those cases of give us the devil we know rather than the devil we don't know. He may be a crook, but he's our crook. And things have been relatively stable under him. The other thing about this is there's a structural issue here. Like all strong men, I think, at all places and times, he has not named a successor. He has not designated someone to follow him. Now, in these kinds of systems, there's a reason for that, because as soon as you designate a successor, everybody sort of shuttles over to his camp, banking on the future, and leaves you alone. Right. So there is no successor, which means that, okay, if Putin doesn't run, what happens next? Nobody knows. Right. And there's been a kind of a certain stability under him. He referees factions. He kind of keeps the lid on. And therefore, I think the idea of an election for him to run for life, if he wanted to, probably not that universally unpopular.
Interesting. Thank you. Yeah. So in the meantime, we're in the middle of perhaps the most controversial election process in American history, with claims of fraud and voter suppression all over the place. So how would you compare these upcoming American elections with the Russian ones under Putin?
Oh boy, what a question. And I was talking to one of my colleagues about this the other day. Either for the American current elections or for the post-Soviet Russian current elections, who would have thought 20 years ago that we'd see a situation like this? I mean, this is a really surprising situation, both here and there. But there are some points of contact, I think. There are some comparisons between Putin elections and Trump elections, let's say.
Mhm.
One of them is that most people, I think, here and there, as they always do, are likely to vote their pocketbook. Um, as James Carville told Bill Clinton when Clinton was running for office, it's the economy, stupid. For a lot of people, there's just one issue. And Putin's popularity goes up and down like a barometer according to the economy there.
Mhm.
And I think there's a lot to say about that happening here too. The other thing too is in both places there's a there's a large apathetic party. You know, you can find people in both places who say politicians all lie. What's the difference? They're all crooks. They don't do what they promise. That happens at both places. There is, as you pointed out, concern both places about falsification. That's always been a kind of concern in Russia, but now with Navalny and pointing out falsifications, it's now a big deal in Russia.
Right.
And as we know, just from reading the newspaper every day, it's a big deal here too, whether you believe in it or not. But there's one significant difference, I would say, between the way politics and power and elections are handled in Russia and here. In Russia, there's a specific. If you look again at the long term of Russian history, and this is something I've been studying lately, continuities over time and over regimes. One of the things you find is that whether it's a prince or a czar or a commissar or a president in Russia, there's always a kind of a fear of the common people, a kind of a disdain for the common people. Before the 1917 revolution, every 100 years or so, the peasants would rise up and kill everybody.
Mhm.
There were explosive and violent peasant revolts. This led the Tsar and his regime, you know, to worry about this, to keep the lid on whatever it took. In the Soviet period, there were also peasant revolts in 1918 and again at the time of collectivization at the end of the 20s. Politicians all through Russian history have shared one attitude, even though they may hate each other. They shared one attitude, and that is, my God, the people can be explosive. It's an X factor. The dark people, the masses, who knows what they'll do. And therefore, there's more of a tendency in Russia over the long term toward dictatorship, tight political controls, controlled elections, preventing chaos. Russian history leads Russians to believe that chaos is always a danger. And
Oh,
they'll vote for stability every time.
but warnings against chaotic mobs are also can also be heard right now in the United States, right?
I know, and it's frightening, actually.
Yeah.
One of those things that 20 years ago, who would have thought that we would be concerned about a contested election in the United States? People carrying guns, the possibility of an uprising. As the Chinese said, may you live in interesting times, but I don't want it to be quite this interesting.
Right, exactly. As you know, Arch, I have one other question for you in store, but it's 12:30, so we'll see if there is time to address that later. I want to go to the Q&A now. People are already asking questions, so please, if you have questions, put them not under the chat, but under the Q&A, where I will be looking for them. And the first one is by William Edmondson, and he writes, how would you characterize elections in the pre-Stalin period?
You mean the Soviet pre-Stalin period, I gather?
The Soviet pre-Stalin, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, until about the mid-1920s, there were contested elections because until the first half of the 1920s, other parties were legal in the Soviet Union. So there were contested elections. Of course, the contesting parties always lost to the Communist Party, either through subterfuge, either through fake elections, or simply because there was a lot popular about the Soviet regime at the time. People generally liked them there for a long time. So yes, there were contested elections in the early years after the revolution.
Right, thank you. Next question is from Louis Siegelbaum. Would you please say a few words about the contributions and legacy of Stephen F. Cohen to our understanding of Soviet and post-Soviet Russia, and particularly American attitudes?
Oh, that's a good question, and I appreciate it. Stephen F. Cohen, as some of you may know, was a leading analyst of the Soviet and post-Soviet systems, an American professor at Princeton and at NYU, who passed away a few weeks ago. His contribution, I think, was enormous because he was one of this early wave of scholars in the 1970s who came out and said, well, we can study this place as if it were a place. It's not all about Stalin's biography. He was one of the leaders, therefore, of the sort of post-totalitarianism wave. More recently, though, he made his mark. He was an important voice for the idea that in the post-Cold War world, there are dangers here in the United States and Russia continuing to confront each other. He argued that there must be ways for us to work together because we have a certain number of common interests: terrorism, nuclear proliferation, the planet. Unfortunately, that voice was a kind of a voice in the wilderness in the current climate today, a current climate characterized by Russophobia, new Cold War thinking. But his contribution, I think, was enormous as a different voice, a new voice, and one that I happen to agree with.
Thank you. Next question is by Bruce Hollihan. One of the most interesting stories which I've heard about life in the Soviet Union was how people would say that if you had a problem with something, like a problem with public works or where you live, you would write a letter to the Soviet leader at that point in time. Not long after, they would get a phone call from the premier directly asking questions, and then after the call, the problem was fixed. Have you heard of this? And also, do you have any similar stories to share about life in Soviet times?
That's, again, a very, very good question. And as it happens, I just wrote about this not too long ago. The Soviet system, like the Russian system for a long time, was a personalized system. Constitutions really didn't matter. Bureaucracies really didn't matter. Power was personal. It was personalized. Your power depended not so much on the formal job you had, but how connected you were, let's say. And for the common folk, writing letters to people of power, short-circuiting the usual procedures, short-circuiting the regular complaint procedure, writing a letter directly to Stalin or to another high official was a very, very common thing. And odd as it may sound to us, it often produced results. The pattern that the questioner just mentioned was a very common pattern. You petitioned the Tsar hundreds of years ago. In the Soviet Union, you petitioned the Tsar Stalin. Now you petition Putin. It's a very common thing, and it often had results. We know, for example, that Putin occasionally does these television talk shows in which common people are allowed to ask questions, and the same thing happens there. Some old lady will stand up and say that the pavement in front of her building is cracking, and Putin will turn around to his assistant and say, "Take care of that."
Right.
The Tsar has granted a favor. So yes, it was very common, and it continues to be common today.
Interesting. I wish that was common everywhere. Elisa Keegan asked for reading suggestions. Maybe we can do that after the interview. But she also says, what do you think of the role of the press and the recent change in the voice of America? I guess the press with regard to Russia.
American press has always been popular in Russia. Of course, it was forbidden for a very long time. But now if you have the right kind of radio in Russia, you can listen to the Voice of America. You can listen to Radio Liberty. You can listen to foreign news. You can get the BBC. You can get CNN there. It's very popular for Russians to listen in to this Western news. On the other hand, they don't necessarily always believe it. You know, Putin is on a campaign now, and a lot of Russians fall into this and always have, that the West means us no good. The West is a kind of a danger. So a lot of people will listen to CNN or whatever from the West and think to themselves, well, okay, maybe that's interesting, but it's not necessarily the truth.
Right. Yeah. Next question is by Anne Bobrov Hayal. She writes, Arch, given your study and mine of continuities in Russian history, and I would argue in American history, how likely do you think it is that the US could end up with a dictator? In other words, how far from centuries-long continuities might a country stray?
What a dangerous question. I think it unlikely that we would end up as a dictator. I think we have enough differing traditions, counter traditions in this country, unlike Russia. I think we have institutional blocks, although they may not always hold up to a determined dictator with a populist following. I think it unlikely, but not impossible. And again, under the May You Live in Interesting Times category, the talk today about possibly defying the election, the talk today about, for example, Trump and his supporters not leaving office smoothly and quietly if there's a perception of a faked election. I think the uproar against that is a sign that we have a certain insurance policy here against it.
Right, thanks. Then we have a question from Deborah Myers. Is Russian interference with elections in other countries felt to be necessary for their survival, or is it all about expansionism?
I don't know if it's always about expansionism. I mean, the idea that Russia would expand into Africa, I think, is pretty ridiculous, let's say. I think a lot of the interference, Russian interference in elections, comes under the heading of propaganda. Anything that can embarrass the other guy is a good idea. It's not that you necessarily are trying to control the other country. You are trying to give perhaps aid and comfort to elements in that country that might be more favorable to you, which is not actually control, it's just good old-fashioned propaganda. I would also note that the United States has been doing it for years. I mean, it's what we do. The Russians are relative newcomers to the idea of influencing with money and power elections in other countries. I'm inclined to think that despite the brouhaha here about Russian interference, I don't think it really influences the election all that much. I think people make up their minds quite aside from what the Russians may or may not want or tell them.
Great, thank you. Otavia Zwillenberg writes, what is your take on Sheila Fitzpatrick's view of Stalinist Russia?
I'm a big fan of Professor Fitzpatrick. She, like Stephen Cohen, was one of the people in the 1970s who said, let's focus on something other than Stalin's personality. In a famous talk that she gave, she said, what if we did Soviet history without politics at all? What if we just looked at society? What if we just looked at how peasants lived? She has books about the everyday life of workers, the everyday life of peasants. How did people cope? How did people put a loaf of bread on the table? How did they react with their neighbors? Her emphasis on social history made an enormous impact, I think, on the way we study Soviet history.
Right. Great. William Edmondson asks, in the Stalin period, were there any competitive intra-party elections?
Not really, not so much. But there was a kind of, inside the Communist Party, from the 1920s on, there were always different tendencies. Now, these tendencies never articulated themselves as factions, never articulated themselves as sub-parties or anything like that. But there was always a kind of a Stalinist hardline thread throughout Soviet history. There was also, though, a kind of a moderate reformist thread throughout Soviet history. Stalin did everything he could to stomp out the reformist thread, even by killing them, but he couldn't kill it altogether. And after Stalin dies, this reformist thread pops up under Khrushchev and pops up in a big way under Gorbachev. So there were not different inter-party contested elections, I would say, at least not formally, but there were different trends inside the party, which one could even classify, if one wanted to, as sort of covert political parties inside the big political party.
Right. Right. So another question here asks if you have ever investigated or looked into elections in other communist East Bloc countries.
I'm afraid not. I've had my hands full trying to figure Russia out for a very long time now. Yeah. But I think it's a productive study. I think it's a good idea. I suspect that what you would find if you looked at elections in, let's say, East Germany or Hungary or Czechoslovakia, something like that, I think you would find similarities, but I think you would also find distinctive cultural differences as well. But I myself have not done it.
Thank you. Yeah. Then another question by Otavia Zwillenberg. Does Stalin's bringing back religion during the Second World War show that he was merely a political pragmatist or actually devoted to the ideology of Stalinism? And I would add, maybe you can also relate this somehow to the resurgence of religion under Vladimir Putin.
Well, I think that Stalin's idea of his own political power as dictator and his idea of pragmatism, I think there's a lot of overlap there. Stalinism, to a considerable extent, was pragmatism. It was putting down, making ideological second place in favor of getting things done. And in this sense, we're talking about industrializing the country. Right. Surely favoring or permitting religious expression in World War II was a totally pragmatic thing. It was not an unpopular thing. One of the things that seems to have stimulated him to do that was the Russian Orthodox Church taking up a collection to buy a tank, the Orthodox Christian tank for the Red Army. Stalin kind of liked that idea. Right. But religion, as we know, was always a threat to the Soviet Union. I mentioned earlier, for example, that Stalin's idea, his brief idea in 1937 to allow multiple candidates, one of the things that dissuaded him from that, and one of the things that terrified him and the others around him, in the 1937 census, more than 50% of the census of the country, the responders, the people, were brave enough to say that they believed in God and they were religious. Only about 40% said that they believed in socialism. That was a terrifying thing. One of the things that led him to cancel the contested elections. So religion was something that for Stalin, he didn't like it. It had to be controlled. He didn't trust the church. He didn't like the church. But when he could use them, well, fine.
Right. And nowadays, of course, the Russian Orthodox Church is a staunch supporter of Putin.
And vice versa.
Yeah.
I was amused by these Putins and Yeltsins and other people in power who were devoted atheistic communists when it suited them to be so, and then suddenly found Jesus and had themselves baptized and go to church. Talk about pragmatism.
Right. So officially our time is up, but I am still going to ask you my last question. On your university homepage, you say, Professor Getty eagerly awaits the final collapse of socialism, capitalism, and all other political systems. So how do you view the future?
That's a bit of an inside joke for my students. I teach my students, or try to teach my students, critical thinking. I teach them that every ism needs to be investigated thoroughly, doubt everything, question everything. Don't take anything on face value, including and especially ideologies. So when I put that on the website, it was a kind of an inside signal to the students, you know, remember kids, there's something wrong with everything.
Right. Arch, I want to thank you so much for a wonderful interview. It was great to have you in this series.
Thank you so much for having me, Joes. This was a very pleasant thing. I had a good time.
Great. Perfect. Perfect. So next week's interview focuses on identity, culture, and resistance in Belarus during the Cold War and right now during the massive public protests following the recent contested elections in Belarus under President Alexander Lukashenko. My guest is UCLA alumna and scholar of Belarusian literature and culture, Sasha Razor. Also, I want to mention again that on Friday, November 20th, Arch Getty will be back presenting a lecture co-organized by the Wende Museum and the Center for European and Russian Studies at UCLA under the title Soviet Anti-Semitisms. Please don't miss that one. And finally, I also want to point out that this coming Sunday at 1 p.m., we'll have a guided Zoom tour through our new exhibitions at the Wende by our education manager, Michael Ballot Garza. Sign-up links for all these events will appear in a follow-up email later today. So I hope to see you there and wish you a wonderful week. Bye-bye.